Hey y'all, my name is Eduardo, and today I'll be reading Marxist Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism by Frank Chapman, Chapter 3 today. Let's begin. Chapter 3, Prelude to U.S. Imperialism. The political objective and consequence of the counter-revolution is the rise of Jim Crow. With the conclusion of the Civil War and the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, former Confederate states had to adopt new state constitutions to be readmitted into the Union. The 14th Amendment legalized former slaves participating in these state constitutional conventions, which created, for the first time in U.S. history, universal male suffrage. State laws prohibiting black voting were overturned. Thereafter, Congress enacted the Enforcement Act of 1870, establishing criminal penalties for interference with the right to vote, and the Force Act of 1871, which provided for federal election oversight. The Force Act was used in 1964 to prosecute law enforcement officers and KKK terrorists in Mississippi. In short, Congress was fomenting a political revolution in the former slaveholding states by ensuring that millions of recently freed slaves were registered to vote and protected by the militia in the exercise of their voting rights. In many jurisdictions or districts, the newly freed black citizens were the majority of the voting population. For example, in South Carolina's Constitutional Convention, there were 76 black and 48 white delegates, and in Louisiana, there were 44 black delegates and 25 white. For the first time, black candidates were elected to state, local, and federal offices. In 1867, no African American held political office in the South. 4 years later, 15% of the office holders were black. That was a higher percentage than in 1990, 25 years after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. Revolution is a process that often stumbles forward and sometimes slips backwards. It is almost never a clean sweep. The 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution only guaranteed the right to vote. It did not guarantee that the vote would be counted, that districts would be apportioned equally, or that voters would be protected from violence and intimidation. Consequently, even the start of Reconstruction with revolutionary measures in place, most of the rebel states sent 1 or 0 African American representatives to Congress. The exceptions were Alabama sending 4 black members to Congress, Mississippi sending 2 black U.S. senators, namely Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, in South Carolina electing 6 black members to Congress. Manning Marable sums up the political profile of black power during Reconstruction. Said he, quote, "The electoral defeat of congressional Democrats in November 1866 and the subsequent impeachment of President Johnson shifted effective power from the president to the radical Republicans. The effect of this political transition was felt almost at once. The passage of the 14th Amendment, which allowed black male adults the electoral franchise, and the federal government's acceptance of black legislative representation, both in the state and the nation. Reconstruction state governments, as a rule, tended to have a smaller percentage of blacks, as merited by their respective numbers in each state. Only one southern state, Mississippi, appointed or elected blacks to the U.S. Senate. Only 14 blacks were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives during Reconstruction. Most of the state's top offices were filled by white Southerners. White historians, dismayed by the phantom of Negro rule, have tried to claim that these men were unfit for public office. Even their white contemporaries, influenced by the deep racism of the day, knew otherwise. 4 of the 16 elected to Congress had received college diplomas. 5 were prominent lawyers. Francis L. Cardozo, who served as South Carolina's Secretary of State from 1868 to 1872, was a former student of the University of Glasgow, Mississippi's two black U.S. senators, Hiram R. Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, were superior in intellect and political acumen to most of their counterparts. Revels was trained in the Ohio Seminary and attended Knox College in Illinois. During the war, he served as a tax collector, sheriff, and superintendent of schools before his election to the U.S. Senate in 1874. He purchased hundreds of acres of farmland in the state's Black Belt region and became one of the most affluent public figures in the South. Between 1869 and 1901, a total of 816 black men were elected as federal and state legislators. Of these, 63% came from just 4 southern states: South Carolina, 218, Virginia, 93, North Carolina, 82, and Louisiana, 122. Some southern and border states with substantial black populations had few or no black elected officials. Kentucky, 0. Maryland, 0. Tennessee, 12. West Virginia, 1. End quote. Today, we have only 3 African Americans in the U.S. Senate, and only a handful have been elected since Reconstruction. But even these less than sweeping reforms gave rise to fierce political reaction of the former slaveholders who wanted to immediately stage a violent counter-revolution under the leadership of former Confederate officers and the Knights of the White Camellia. These were white supremacist terrorist groups first organized by former Confederate generals George Gordon and Nathan Bedford Forrest and other Confederate veterans and rich planters. By violence and intimidation, these racist groups prevented the enforcement of the 15th Amendment. In 1876, the U.S. Supreme Court narrowed the scope of the Enforcement Act and the Force Act by holding that the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment applied only to state action and not the action of individuals, thus paving the way of giving the white minority former slaveholders political control of the southern states. For the most part, illegal means were used to establish white political supremacy. First, terrorist violence, i.e. murder and intimidation, was used to suppress black voter turnout. And second, once in office, white elected officials and politicians proceeded to enact and enforce disenfranchising laws, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, vouchers of good character, and disqualification for crimes of turpitude. The political process utilizing all these tactics was called redemption. In order to convey a real sense of the South's political reaction, let us take the words of President Grant himself describing conditions in Louisiana. Grant wrote to the U.S. Senate January 13, 1875, the following, quote, "On the 13th of April, 1873, a butchery of citizens was committed at Colfax, Louisiana, which in bloodthirstiness and barbarity is hardly surpassed by any acts of savage warfare. Insuperable obstructions were thrown in the way of punishing these murderers, and the so-called conversation papers not only justified the massacre of over 105 African Americans in an effort to unseat duly elected black office holders, but announced as federal tyranny and despotism the attempt of the United States officers to bring them to justice." End quote. Some of these murderers were charged, but the U.S. Supreme Court in the Cruikshank decision cited above found the indictments faulty, and no one was successfully prosecuted. It was by these methods of politically motivated terrorism that the Reconstruction governments were overthrown and black people were disenfranchised. In 1875, President Grant refused to send federal troops into Mississippi. In 1876, the presidential election between Hayes and Tilden was undecided. The Democrats agreed to concede if Hayes would promise to withdraw federal troops from the South. Hence, the fatal blow to black Reconstruction was delivered. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes ordered the federal troops out of the South, thus allowing the white racist minority of ex-slaveholders to continue to seize political power and use the state as an instrument for disenfranchising African Americans. In the eyes of the planter class, who were simply agrarian capitalists exploiting slave labor, the worst thing that came out of the Civil War was freeing the slaves, which meant that black people could no longer be bought and sold like farm chattel. And after that, transforming them into free, educated, voting citizens. As far as ex-slave holders were concerned, this meant the eventual ruin of all civilization. The rich white planters, though a minority, were able to win over to their ideals the vast majority of poor whites. In other words, the rich whites of the South promised the poor, ignorant, and impoverished whites that their problems would be addressed through white unity against African Americans. This kind of clearly stated and organized racist politics set the stage for the enactment of black codes for legalizing racism and pushing black workers to the bottom, making them super exploited workers, and for the creation of a class locked in a semi-feudal property relation in the planter-dominated countryside. So not only were black people denied the vote, they were forced back into the cotton fields under slave-like conditions that turned the South into a medieval torture chamber. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his already cited work, Black Reconstruction, points out, quote, "Finally, the poor whites joined the sons of the planters and disenfranchised the black laborer, thus nullifying the labor movement in the South for half a century or more," end quote. In fact, one might add that this gutting of democracy and economic, cultural, and social retardation it caused in the South continues to this day as one of the main roadblocks to all progressive and working class struggles in the United States. In 1890, the state of Louisiana passed a law known as the Separate Car Act, which required black and white people to ride in separate railroad cars. An interracial group of New Orleans residents formed the Committee of Citizens dedicated to repealing the racist law. The challenge came as a result of Homer Adolph Plessy being arrested for taking a seat in a white-only car. It was argued in court that the Separate Car Act was unconstitutional because it denied Citizen Plessy his right pursuant of the 13th and 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The presiding judge was John Howard Ferguson, who ruled that Louisiana could regulate railroad companies within its borders. This decision was later upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, which accepted racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. Thus, legally began the era of Jim Crow, i.e., racist segregation in public facilities. On November 4, 1898, the Raleigh News and Observer newspaper noted, quote, "The first Red Shirt Parade." The Red Shirts were avowed white supremacists in a paramilitary group used by Southern Democrats. On horseback, ever witnessed in Wilmington, North Carolina, electrified the people today. It created enthusiasm among the whites and consternation among the Negroes. The whole town turned out to see it. It was an enthusiastic body of men, end quote. 6 days after the parade and rally, the Red Shirt planned to overthrow the duly elected local government of black and white Republicans in Wilmington, North Carolina, was successfully carried out. This was the first admitted coup d'etat in U.S. history. Thus, by these dastardly means, the Northern capitalist and Southern planter slaughtered democracy in the South and crippled it in the nation. Yet, it must be acknowledged that in less than a decade, black people played a revolutionary role in the battle for democracy during Reconstruction. Here were a people fresh out of 250 years of bondage that achieved remarkable democratic gains, even though they were betrayed by Republicans and threatened with extermination by Democrats. Black people became aware quite quickly of how to use their political power as an instrument of their liberation. In 10 years, they made 100 years of history. In the words of Torgy, a famous carpetbagger, quote, "They instituted a public school system in a realm where public schools had been unknown. They opened the ballot box and jury box to thousands of white men who had been debarred from them by a lack of earthly possessions. They introduced home rule in the South. They abolished the whipping post and branding iron, the stock, and other barbarous forms of punishment, which had up to this time prevailed. They reduced capital felonies from about 20 to 2 or 3. In an age of extravagance, they were not extravagant in the sums appropriated for public works. In all that time, no man's rights of person were invaded under the forms of laws, end quote. With that, Du Bois called the, quote, counter-revolution of property, end quote. The planter class overthrew what might have become the cornerstone of bourgeois democracy, the enfranchisement of former slaves and poor white farmers. This counter-revolution thereby turned the whole spiritual and economic material development in a reactionary direction predicated on the disenfranchisement of black people in the South and the brutal suppression of working class rebellions against the rapidly rising monopoly capitalists in the North. Du Bois wrote that the United States, quote, became the cornerstone of that new imperialism which is subjugating the labor of yellow, brown, and black peoples to the dictation of capitalism on a world basis. And it has not only brought near the revolution by which the power of capitalism is to be challenged, but also it is transforming the fight to the sinister aspect of a fight on racial lines embittered by awful memories, end quote. By 1910, the United States was an undisputed imperialist power, and Jim Crow, the racist institution of the South, was a fait accompli. Racial segregation was legal and spread like a cancer throughout the land. Jim Crow policy and denying the voting rights of African Americans prevailed despite periodic legal challenges in court. Not until the Civil Rights Congress started organizing against lynching from the 1930s to the 1950s, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision of Brown versus the Board of Education and Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on the bus, do we see any prospect or hope for federal intervention. From the very beginning, one of the primary goals of the civil rights movement was restoring the voting rights of black people, which were taken because of the overthrow of the black Reconstruction governments of the South. End of chapter 3.